A welcome, huge big welcome to all of you for joining us today. My name is Taryn Fort. I'm the Senior Director of Communications and External Influence here at the Colorado Health Foundation. And I just have a few sort of welcome remarks and housekeeping tips, and then we're going to go ahead and officially get going. So for those of you who may be a little less familiar with us here at the Colorado Health Foundation, we are a statewide grant maker focused squarely on bringing health and reach for all Coloradans. And we really do that work in a whole lot of different ways. Primarily by working in communities all over the state of Colorado through investing in grant making, through public policy and advocacy work, through capacity building, and also through moments like this one today where we're gathered together to explore a complex issue related to health and inequity. And I'm really excited to introduce our second 2021 virtual event in the At the Heart of the Matter series. This is a series that we've been doing now for over a year. And of course, it features our president and CEO, Karen McNeil-Miller, who's been hosting conversations with national and local leaders and experts about the impact of racism and racial injustices on the health of communities of color in particular, along with exploring ways that we can all work toward equity and justice once and for all. And it's timely that it happens to be Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, as today's conversation, The Hate Stops Here, Addressing Anti-Asian Acts, does feature Karen along with a handful of leaders from the Colorado AAPI community. The group is pretty dynamic. I think you all are going to really enjoy them. I got a little sneak peek into the amazing energy that they have, and you can expect to hear them discussing, of course, the incredible power within the AAPI community, along with the challenges they're facing, including how the pandemic in particular has really intensified waves of anti-Asian hate and violence that is harming and debilitating to individual and community health. And we also know from all of you through the registration data that you shared that you're interested in learning more about how to effectively curb this increased discrimination, along with exploring solutions and ways that we can all be more anti-racist and supportive of the AAPI community. So two final items. So we are recording today's conversation, as you all just heard, in English and French and Spanish and Vietnamese, and we'll share those recordings along with a short evaluation survey via email in the next day or so. And we do really ask that you share your feedback in the survey. We do use it, we apply it, and we try to improve everything that we do with it. So please do share any thoughts that you have with us in the survey. And I'll also just note that those recordings are going to be available in the coming days as well on our website at coloradohealth.org. And then we do, of course, have hundreds of folks with us today. So we've muted audio to minimize any background noise, but we also do invite your commentary, your thoughts, your tips and resources. So we're asking that you do all of that using the chat function, as I mentioned at the beginning. And again, there's a little trick to the chat function. So make sure that when you're using it today, that you're selecting the drop-down option that is sending your comments to all panelists and attendees. I will also just say that if you're having any technical difficulties, so please send those to us via the chat, and we will do our very best to address those as well. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Courtney Ozaki. Courtney is the founder and creative director of the Denver-based Japanese Arts Network, a national network that provides access to resources and also develops programs that support and strengthen the visibility of Japanese and Japanese American artists all over the United States. And Courtney, we're so thrilled that you could join us. I'm going to go ahead and turn everything over to you.
Thank you so much, Taryn, and thank you so much to the Colorado Health Foundation for having me today to share a little piece of art with you. I just really quickly wanted to set the tone for what you're about to view. This is a music film that we created during the height of pandemic. So we were all apart, but we were all able to be together. And you're going to hear from Christopher Bennett, who is also known as MC32. He'll be reflecting on how he has just observed a Japanese woman who entered the subway station and sat on the same subway car as him. And he's been watching her with this longing look of natsukashi on her face, which is a Japanese word for yearning for the past. So she had been listening to the song Akatombo, which is a childhood favorite folk song of hers about a red dragonfly. So I will let you hear from Chris now.
I greet her with a smile and a hello. She smiles back and returns that hello. Sparking a light conversation, I mentioned how peaceful and relaxed she looked and asked what she was listening to. She laughed and said it was a popular song she learned as a kid back where she's from. Intrigued, I say, "Oh, really? And where are you from?" Her answer went something like this. She told me that she came from the land of the rising sun, where honor was the path before the way of the gun. A culture so rich that the West can't compare. The breeze carried scents of cherry blossoms in the air. She said it's more than just the lights and the tech in Tokyo, but samurai and ninjas are all people really know. Said I grew up in the country, so in tune with the land. Father built a smoke Oteji with the strength of his hands. There was peace with the earth, there was give, there was take. I can still taste the fish she would catch from the lake. Have respect for our neighbors, though our neighbors far and few. The ancestors whispered lessons through the bamboo, so she missed the summer rains and the calm of the snow and the call from the cranes and the grain she would sow. So she loves where she is, but she misses where she's from. With thunder makes the sound of the taiko drum, the taiko drum. The thunder makes the sound of the taiko drum, of the taiko drum, the taiko drum. The thunder makes the sound of the taiko. The taiko drum, the taiko drum. The thunder makes the sound of the taiko drum, of the taiko drum, the taiko drum. The thunder makes the sound of the taiko. So she came from the land of the rising sun, where honor was the path before the way of the gun. Her parents worked so hard just to bring her to the States. Took a while to get accustomed without feeling out of place. It's like a different world with so many different faces. Country so new with so many different races. Marveled in the fact she's in this melting pot too. It was nothing like she knew before but had to make do. Then the language and the cadence and she started life anew. She was young when she arrived and now she's turning 32 and pushed through. The love for her new home has since grew, but admits that a visit home has been way overdue. So she listens to the sounds of some Okinawan bands, such her eyes and thinks about her father working with his hands, connected to the past with the rising of the sun. With thunder makes the sound of the taiko drum, the taiko drum. The thunder makes the sound of the taiko drum, of the taiko drum, the taiko drum. The thunder makes the sound of the taiko. The taiko drum, the taiko drum. The thunder makes the sound of the taiko drum, of the taiko drum, the taiko drum. The thunder makes the sound of the taiko. The taiko drum, the taiko drum. The thunder makes the sound of the taiko drum, of the taiko drum, the taiko drum. The thunder makes the sound of the taiko. The taiko drum, the taiko drum. The thunder makes the sound of the taiko drum, of the taiko drum, the taiko drum. The thunder makes the sound of the taiko. So she came from the land of the rising sun, of the rising sun. She told me that she came from the land of the rising sun, the rising sun. She told me that she came from the land of the rising sun, of the rising sun. She told me that she came from the land of the rising sun. With thunder makes the sound of the taiko drum.
Hey, Courtney, thank you so much for that.
And thank you.
That just really shows the interdependence and the intersection of all kinds of art. There was movement, there was a spoken word, there was drumming, there was melody. Was that your creation, the body of that work?
Yes, yeah. I mean, we did it collaboratively. The filming was actually done by a Japanese American filmmaker. His name's Bruce Tetsuya, and the editing. And then the people that you saw on the list at the end, it was a collaborative effort between Christopher Bennett, myself, Margaret Ozaki Graves, and Kevin Sakai. And we'd done it before live for the CBCA luncheon, but we wanted to be able to do it together when we were apart as well. So yeah, we really enjoyed being able to share the intersectionality between our art forms as well as our cultures. So yeah, it was a nice thing to be able to share with people during a time when we weren't really able to be together.
Well, you can't see it now, but when you look through all the chats, you'll see a lot of congratulations and kudos for the piece. And someone even said that they actually saw it live.
Oh, great.
And how amazing it was.
Yeah,
Is the drumming something that is indigenous to your culture?
Yes, so taiko, which actually means drum in Japanese, is a traditional Japanese art form, but taiko as a performing art has only been around since the 1950s and was introduced by a Japanese jazz drummer, and then was brought to 1950s or 60s, yeah, and then brought to the United States in the 1960s to San Francisco first. So yeah.
Where did you learn it?
I learned it. I was fortunate enough that my aunt and uncle played taiko my entire life. And so they started teaching my cousins and I when I was about 8 years old. So it's definitely been ingrained in my sort of identity since I was a young child.
Oh, that's great. Now, I think people are going to want to know how to get in touch with you. So when we finish, how about put your information in the chat if you don't mind?
Yeah, happy to.
And what other kinds of art expression do you engage in?
I'm a creative producer, so I like to create platforms for artists to collaborate in meaningful ways. So I like to work with visual artists a lot. A couple of artists locally that I've worked with are like Akemi Tsutsu Kunitake and Casey Kawaguchi. Akemi's an illustrator and Casey's an illustrator, but also a painter, muralist. And I like to create opportunities for, visual artists to connect with performing artists at events, and also be able to share sort of elements of Japanese culture, but also that intersectionality between cultures. I think that's something I'm really trying to lift up right now, because I just really believe that builds empathy and understanding amongst all of us. So and I also have produced dance and theater. Those are kind of the main things that I've produced over the past several years.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much for honoring us with your gift. We appreciate it so much.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.
Have a great panel.
All right. So welcome everyone that's joined us online so far. I seem to be having both audio issues and major allergy attack today. So my voice kind of goes in and out. So I apologize for that. Welcome everybody. I am so excited that this is the first time for us that we've translated into 3 languages. We have traditionally done Spanish, but at the request of participants, also French and Vietnamese this time. And so we are committed to language justice and that people being able to participate and communicate and hear in a language that is most comfortable to them. So we're excited about this opportunity. And I'm excited about our conversation today, a very timely conversation, given that maybe even right now, President Biden is signing the anti-Asian hate crime bills into effect. So I'm going to introduce the rest of our panelists and have them go ahead and put themselves on video and then wave so people will know who you are. First, Joey Ha, who's the founder of CORE, which stands for Community Organizing for Radical Empathy. And Joey, I cannot tell you how much I love the name of your organization. Then we have DJ Ida, who's Executive Director for the National Asian American Pacific Islander Mental Health Association. Clarence Lowe, who's a board member for the Asian Chamber of Commerce here in Colorado. And Chad Shimura, who's the Assistant Professor at CU Denver in the Department of Political Science. So welcome everyone. You know, with all of these at the heart of the matter, I won't say all, with most of at the heart of the matter, we end up tackling topics that it's a shame we have to talk about. It's a shame that they are conversations that we have to have. And so the conversation today about the rise of violence against those of Asian descent, the rise of harassment against those of Asian descent. And I don't know if it was President Biden that recently said, there's no place for hate in America. And while I know all of us and everyone that's on this call agrees with that, the fact is right now that's still an aspirational statement. It is not a statement of reality. And so we'll start at that national level, because today is the day that President Biden is signing the anti-Asian hate crime bills. What's that mean to you? And I'm going to ask DJ to start there.
I think the fact that at this level and for this president to be signing such an important piece is really, really, it's critical for our communities. And we're going through this little sea change, which is really, really important from where we've been just very recently. And I think it gives us hope, but I couldn't agree with you more that it is an aspirational statement. But it's conversations like today, the conversations that are happening literally all over the country. It's really, really crucial, because if we don't, and very, very much for the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders, we've always been sort of the hidden community that people don't realize that we're seeing the racism, the mental health issues, the two issues that are really coming to the forefront over this last year. The good news about all this stuff is it's raising awareness, but there's a long road to go. But it does give me hope that we are going to be able to make some real substantive changes. And just add the one little comment there is a thank you to the Colorado Health Foundation. The fact that you had interpreters doing live interpreting throughout this, again, I think it's that sensitivity to the way that we address so that all of our communities can be engaged. But I'm tired, but I do have hope. So thanks.
Thanks, DJ. Chad, how about you?
Hi, thank you. And before I speak, I want to acknowledge that those of us in Colorado are in the territories of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute peoples. And I raise this because I think it's important as a kind of context to recognize the history of settler colonialism and genocide that we're all kind of implicated in, and that shapes the way in which we think about confronting anti-Asian racism moving forward. Now, regarding the question about this bill, I think it's important that we have national recognition, but we all know that national recognition isn't enough. And I think that we also need to question the terms by which recognition is conferred. And I think that one significant error about the bill, and one perhaps caution for us moving forward, is that it's all about strengthening law enforcement and policing. And I think that if we want to talk about racial justice, we can't think about our struggles in isolation from the struggles of Black communities, Latinx communities, and Native communities. And I think one thing I'll just throw out there, and I hope that we can talk about, is whether or not it would be valuable to shift the conversation from stopping anti-Asian hate to ending white supremacy.
We will certainly get there before this conversation is over, I'm sure, Chad. Thank you. Joey.
Hi, thanks for having me here today. Thanks, Chad, for the land acknowledgement. I think hearing about it, it is heartening to see that there is some national recognition of this issue, as it has been something that's been going on ever since Asians have arrived here. So there's some heartening aspects to it, but at the same time, some questions that come to mind is, well, why did it take so long for us to get here? Why did it take for all of these things to happen before people finally paid attention? And what's going to be done after the bill? What happens when this is no longer trendy? What happens when our hashtag is no longer on Twitter's trending? And it's important to note that similar to what Chad says, a lot of the change has to come from our communities itself too. Yes, it's good, we need those top-down approaches, but we really do need grassroots, bottom-up organizing, because a lot of this is a cultural issue. You can make all of these policy changes, but if people continue to believe that communities of color, that marginalized individuals are beneath them, like what Chad was saying about white supremacy, those policies aren't going to do much. So I think, to sum it up, I am heartened, but at the same time wary of what exactly that means and the implications of the work that we still have left to do.
Thank you. And Clarence.
As you can hear, there is a recurring theme already with our panelists, and I echo that this bill, while encouraging, is also a bit disenfranchising because one, it should not ever take an act of Congress or a signature of a president to enforce what we already know is wrong. What we already know is isolating and marginalizing. And like Joey said, when this news cycle turns around, and when this proverbial target is off our back, who's the next underrepresented or minority group who's going to be in the news cycle? Who is going to die? Who is going to be affected for not only from our communities, but also our generations of future community activists and citizens and leaders? So and we will get to this in this conversation today, but how we can engage not only in the national dialogue, but also from within our own communities and within our own adjoining cities here in the Denver metro area.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to read a quote from President Biden, and I'm going to ask for your reaction to it, just a piece of it. It's a very short quote. And it was him talking about the anti-Asian hate crime bills. For more than a year, far too many Asian Americans have woken up each morning increasingly fearful for their safety and the safety of their loved ones. Okay, so that's the quote. Now, I think we know the answer because I think you've already touched on some of it, but I want you to react to the very first words, which was for more than a year. So how would you respond, to President Biden that, has this just been in the past year that this has happened? Or does he have his timing wrong there? Clarence, go ahead.
Not so much timing, again, we stand in solidarity, not only with our Black communities, but our Latinx and LGBTQ communities, and we talk about the ebbs and flows of systemic and racial inequities over time, right? I know we're talking about AAPIs today, but the Black experience has gone on for over 400 years. The AAPI experience has gone over 200 years in this country, right? So yes, again, has it gone, has it really raised this profile over the last arguably 18 months or so? Yes, right? But it has never really gone away through the whole immigrant experience.
Anyone else want to react to that?
Just watching the faces, I'm sure we're all sort of thinking the same thing. The way that reads, I think for all of us, what happened over the last year and a half just shown it just sort of put a spotlight on things that we have known, which have been going on since we first came here. And this is nothing new. And that's the frustrating part of it, as everybody has said, it's taken so long.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the good news, bad news. The good news is we've got awareness. The bad news is it took so long and we've got a long ways to go.
Yeah.
So I think hopefully he doesn't mean it the way it grammatically came out, because that really would be a complete misunderstanding of what our histories are.
Exactly. And I think, and we'll come back to that, but I think that's a theme throughout all of the histories of oppression, that just because it becomes news to you doesn't make it new. doesn't make it just news.
It was just one thing, and I don't want to, but it was like when people said racism was over because Barack Obama was elected president, it was, I think, just a shocking comment that people would think that that was the end of racism for African American communities. So it's that simplistic perspective is needs to be dealt with.
Before you go on, I want to just tell the folks that are watching, feel free to put comments or questions in the chat. I'll watch it and I'll try to bring some of those in. That's been one of the benefits of Zoom, because if we were sitting in an auditorium, it would be considered very rude for you to start making comments while other people are talking. So that's been one of the benefits of Zoom. We can still have the interactive experience. I don't know if you've seen the movie The Help, it's about it's a fictionalized account of Black maids in the South. And in one of the scenes, one of the main characters is being interviewed for a book. And she said, and her quote is, "Nobody ever asked me before what it like to be me." And so I'm going to ask you that. What's it been like to be of Asian descent these past 18 months? Who'd like to start?
A stream of emotions, Karen. I am a second generation Chinese American who was born in San Francisco's Chinatown. And that Chinatown is arguably one of the oldest Chinatowns in the United States. And probably one of the more concentrated ones, if you will. My parents immigrated from Southern China in the late 50s and 40s to San Francisco. When I think of what has been going on, I think of my pride, my heritage. I am infuriated and frustrated to hear of the attacks and violence on our elder AAPIs. I think of my mother, who is 80 years old this year, who lives in the Bay Area, and my father as well, who's 85, being attacked, right? I mean, by, action by association. You see them in their eyes, and you see this old lady on Market Street in San Francisco kicking the butt of her attacker. Good for her. So I feel rage, but I also feel optimism and encouragement that we can move this needle forward. And as I call it, an inflection point.
Joey, how about you?
Yeah, that's a big question, Karen. I had to think about it, and having to reflect on the past 18 months, it's hard to put into words. I think I am very distinctly aware of the way I look and how I present myself in society. And I also feel incredibly privileged in a lot of ways too. For me, I work from home. I don't have to be outside bearing the pandemic and racism. And I just sort of think about, I had a few opportunities to do some interviews with folks in the news media, and a lot of them asked, well, has anything happened to you in the past 18 months or so? And I'd answer, well, no, because, I've been staying at home. I haven't been interacting with folks in those particular ways. But, I've had a lot of things happen to me in my past. I was like 10, finished my piano lessons in a suburban white neighborhood. A truck rolls by shouting out "chink." I have been sexually harassed with a racist aspect. And my mom has been verbally assaulted, and my brother has been also been verbally assaulted. And it's, for me, I'm just sort of in the mindset where I am glad that this is getting attention. This is an opportunity for us to move that needle forward. But at the same time, it's so disheartening that it came to this, because there were no media interviews, right? When my mom was being followed by a pickup truck in her own neighborhood, there was no attention or support for my brother when the white woman in his neighborhood asked why he was there. Where was the support then? And I guess it's not a clear answer, because I haven't had really much of an opportunity to reflect on everything. And it's not over either, right? So I guess that's, I think that I'm just sort of in this position where I haven't been able to fully process everything. And I think it's hard to ask folks to process it, especially if you're in the middle of it. But I thank you for the question, and it gave me some time to think about it right now.
Chad, how about you? You look deep in thought.
Yeah, I think like Joy, you know, it's and thank you for the question, really, and welcoming us to use this space to talk about what we feel. And I think that the question, what we feel, is particularly important now, given some of the one of the kind of most important pieces of Asian American literature to come out within the past, I don't know how many years, is Kathy Park Hong's book, Minor Feelings. And I think that minor feelings, as she describes it, is this kind of racialized range of emotions about the disconnect between, yes, there we go. It's the disconnect between this brand of American optimism that progress is being made and that everything is all right, and what we actually feel very intensely. And I know for me, what I've been feeling over the past 18 months has been this mix of grief, outrage, exhaustion, trepidation, and so on. Because even if nothing is happening directly to me, in the sense that, in a comparable sense to, you know, a lot of the most vicious attacks, you know, we can't help but wonder, well, who's next, right? Is it going to be me? Is it going to be, you know, someone I love and care about? Is it going to be someone in my family? Is it going to be a friend, a colleague, and so on? And I think, like Joey said, we know that there's not going to be much support in place, right? And the very fact, you know, what you said earlier, Karen, at the beginning of the conversation, right? It's a shame that we even need to have this conversation. And it's a shame that we need to even ask for support, right? Support is just kind of a bandage on the way to a world where we don't need support, because the framework of anti-Asian racism as a symptom of white supremacy is no longer with us. Right. And so that's what I'm feeling right now, that there's so much work to be done. And, you know, a lot of people, I think, have been exaggerating the kind of impact that we're seeing right now. You know, I think, as Joey mentioned earlier, right, what's going to happen after APA Heritage Month ends, right? What's going to happen in June when these conversations go away, when the spotlight in the media turns elsewhere, right? So I think that one of the things that, you know, I've really been feeling is not a sense of optimism, right? It's more like, what evidence will there be that this long-standing history that all of us have been talking about, this long-standing history of anti-Asian racism, will continue?
Thank you. DJ, I'm gonna ask you to start helping us bring it more local, Colorado. So how do you think, what's been the experience of the communities that you all represent? Yeah. How are your communities, our neighbors, how are they faring? What's been the impact, not only of just the pandemic, but of this increase in hate crime and harassment?
One of the things, and again, this is an excellent question, and one of the challenges that we have always faced, which is both a strength and something that makes it very difficult, is the great diversity within the Asian American Pacific Islander communities, which also means there isn't one simple answer. And much of what is happening in this community is really reflected in the comments of the other three panelists, and that there is a wide range, and it's just a cumulative effect. So everybody, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of anything, is feeling what's happening with the pandemic, feeling the frustration of mixed messages, lack of consistent leadership. And then it's coming down to us in the racial terms in sense of being blamed for the pandemic. I know that when we look at the Asian Pacific Development Center and you talk to their clinicians and their providers who are from the community, they are both living the experience while trying to help the community members cope with it. And that is resulting in tremendous burnout. There are others who are lost, who are doing the listening circles, who say, I hear it and I believe that there's racism. I don't know how to respond to it because I personally am not feeling it. So I think it's really important that as we're looking at what's happening, we really look at that. We don't say this is the way that all Asian Americans are responding. There are people, the other thing that's really And I've been hearing this, whether it was in the local or the other, they're going, I don't know how to respond. And for some of them, they're afraid to. And one of the things about hate crimes that is different from other crimes, and it's not to ever say that one crime is better or easier than the others, but hate crimes isn't about being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's being perceived as the wrong person all the time. And it goes to the core, which makes it very, very difficult for people to even want to speak up and talk about it. So even for folks who say, I'm not sure, they may be, but they're going to go, I don't want to admit that somebody hates me just for the color of my skin. So I think that's why everything that we're saying is it's not going to go over to me. In fact, it sure doesn't. When I was talking about the hope, it's that this is finally getting the national attention to the degree that it should have been there ages ago. And if we can hold on to that and not let this slip away, that's the hope that I have. But we've got a long ways to go. But it's a very complex question, so thank you.
Chad, I saw you nodding vigorously, and I think what DJ's also lifting up is the trauma that's now within the community. How do you see that trauma, or for any of you, but I'm just starting with you, Chad, how do you see that trauma manifesting itself?
Yeah, I think that's a terrific question. And I think just to return to your earlier question too, to bring that in, I think one of the things that I would say is I don't feel like I represent a community. I think the community and the communities of Asians and Asian Americans are unrepresentable because of the complexity and the richness and the depth of our own lives. And that one of the ways in which I think I heard DJ saying that I really resonate with, right, is that because of that complexity, there's no sort of single model for a kind of solution or for even understanding the problem, right? It's an array of complex problems, not a single one. And so with your question regarding trauma, I think what's really important there is that from what I see and from what I research in relation to feelings and trauma and so on, is that trauma, our imagination of it tends to be, there's this very spectacular, kind of very intense, disruptive event, right? And then what we don't see is the way in which trauma for a lot of racialized peoples and communities is more seamlessly interwoven into everyday life, right? Such that it's not as if there's one pronounced event or a series of pronounced events, but it's a whole continuum of activities. And I think that's one thing that, I've been seeing a little bit more. And in terms of the communities that I'm involved in, primarily around the University of Colorado, Denver, I think the element of trauma really is the severe disappointment that, especially after the Atlanta shootings, that there wasn't space and there wasn't recognition and there wasn't any dialogue about what was happening. It was kind of like people were just going on with business as usual. And a lot of times, someone of Asian or Asian American descent might be the only one in the Zoom meeting or in a series of Zoom meetings where everyone's smiling and making jokes. And then there was this horrific event, right? And from what I was hearing, for some people, it seemed like the damage and the pain and the trauma really of not having a space of conversation was just as, if not more intense than the kind of initial impact of learning about the Atlanta shootings itself.
Anyone else? Clarence, go ahead.
Karen, as a board member of the Asian Chamber of Commerce, we have a pretty good pulse on, the Asian small businesses along the, Federal Alameda corridor, out on Havana, in Aurora, and so forth. And I'll tell you that before we shut down, right? What was it? Last March, we're already, our businesses are already telling us they're feeling a significant decrease in business. The slurs, the side eyes. We've had, Asian grocery stores, storefront windows broken, graffitied, spit on. All of that. And some of our Asian businesses has had as much as 80% decrease in business over this time. Obviously, a lot of them are struggling. Some are not coming back. Some have closed. We have helped as the chamber has helped some of these businesses owners get access to, PPP and other help locally. Like Chad said, it's such a difficult and complex issue to get around, even for businesses, because when you lump all all of our ethnic groups into Asian, right? You talk about the Vietnamese businesses and the Korean, Japanese, Chinese, and Filipino. We all have our individual, if you will, silos of challenges. But we're also encouraged that during this pandemic, especially earlier last year, Denver Mayor Hancock, came out. Governor Polis actually had lunch with us at one of our dim sum houses on South Federal as a show of support, for our Asian businesses. And most recently, Senators Hickenlooper and Bennett also visited the Far East Center with leadership from the Asian Chamber and others in also support of our recovery and hopefully that unity in our Asian businesses.
Go ahead, Joey.
Sorry, I've been just sort of marinating and thinking about how to add on to all of these really great inputs from the panelists. And I do want to, again, reinforce that the Asian American Pacific Islander umbrella is enormous. It covers dozens of ethnicities and thousands of languages, around 2,500 languages. And just to remind folks that there's a danger to a single story and the AAPI experience is not monolithic. That being said, we were able to host a couple of town halls where we encouraged folks to come in and talk about what they were feeling, what they needed, and how to move forward as a community. And a lot of the conversations fell into 4 different buckets. One of which was reporting. There were large barriers to reporting. There were language barriers, cultural barriers, and there's general fear of reporting. There are folks in the community that are fearful of law enforcement. They may be undocumented and don't feel like they want to talk to any type of structural organization to talk more about it. Additionally, you have folks that just don't believe what had happened to them rises up to need to be reported. So that's one of the buckets things had fallen into. Another was education. There's not enough education on Asian American Pacific Islander history and culture. As a matter of fact, there's not enough education about any marginalized communities' histories in our curriculum. And when we talk about bullying, anti-bullying programs too, there isn't a aspect where we talk about bullying through the lens of a racial lens or a gendered lens or things of that sort. And we're also seeing folks getting bullied in school for being Asian. Our last 2 buckets were victim support. Folks felt that when they actually reported, they didn't get the support that they needed. They didn't feel like there was a lot of community safe spaces. And like what Chad was mentioning, in the spaces that folks existed in, they didn't feel that their issues were important or what was going on was important to the people that were surrounding them. And lastly was prevention and protection. Folks just didn't feel like there was enough protection or prevention from allies and the sort. So that's sort of what we found from our town hall.
Thank you. Someone just put in the chat that President Biden just now signed. I have CNN on over here, so yes, he's up. He's already signed the bill. And so I want to loop back to several things that you have already said. So this bill is these crime bills are a criminal justice law enforcement response to events that fall under criminal justice and law enforcement. The big things where there's an actual threat of physical violence, where there's actual physical violence. So I want to talk about the criminal aspect of it. And there's also the part that you all have been talking about that's not covered as a hate crime. That's not actionable by law enforcement. That I saw one author coined it as the sidewalk harassment. Having somebody roll down their window and yell at you, the subtle and not so subtle sexualization of women of Asian and Pacific Island descent. So I want to kind of break that up. Let's talk about the criminalization aspect. And because as you all mentioned, there are lots of Asian Pacific Islander groups that were opposed to actually the bill because it was a punitive law enforcement response that came after the fact rather than something else. So let's start with that. Let's just talk about not just the bill, but the whole notion of the criminalization process of these kinds of incidents. And Chad, I think you might have been the first one to bring it up. So I'm going to ask you if you can start there.
Sure, I'll try. I mean, one of the organizations that actually has spoken out against the bill is Stop AAPI Hate, the organization that has been gathering a lot of the self-reporting. You know, the statistic that people know after the Atlanta shootings, that there were 3,800 incidents self-reported of harassment and abuse, vandalism, and so forth, and which, by the way, by the end of this past March, it rose to 6,600. Okay, and we don't know if that's, you know, due to an explosion of events happening or more people feeling emboldened to come speak up. But this organization has spoken out against this bill for precisely the reasons that you mentioned, Karen, which is that it's all about strengthening law enforcement and policing, which is precisely what a lot of people in Asian and Asian American communities are against. And one thing that the bill does that I thought was kind of interesting was that it says that, well, judges should recommend things like community service and educational programs. And I would suspect that all of us here think that education is great and that everyone should have access to it, right? And so I think that, as Joy was mentioning earlier, right, there's a need for more education. And one of the things that Stop AAPI Hate is calling for is more funding and more resources for ethnic studies. You know, we need more ethnic studies programs, not only at the college and university levels, but, you know, through primary and secondary education as well. You know, and I think that one of the things I know a lot of people who are showing up are looking for action items. Ethnic studies at the University of Colorado, Denver is a program. It's not a department, meaning its status is more precarious. It doesn't have as many faculty lines, and it's not as well funded. So if you want, you know, one action item, it would be to push the regents to say, we need ethnic studies as a department at the University of Colorado, Denver. And then sort of more generally, I think, I think maybe we can talk about the question of sidewalk harassment in a moment, but I think on the aspect of criminalization, I think one of the things that's dangerous about that rhetoric is that it's thoroughly racialized. Right? We have to ask, well, who is automatically presumed to be a criminal or to engage in criminal activities such that they'll be the targets of policing under this kind of expanded powers and expanded resources that this bill provides. And I think that's something that we as Asian and Asian Americans and allies should be critical of.
Clarence, go ahead, and then we'll talk about the sidewalk harassment.
I can't even. I mean, there are too many instances of racialized law enforcement, as I'll just put in parentheses or in quotes, right? I was just reflecting on, you know, you're guilty as, you know, until proven innocent, and it just burns me. On one hand, like I said, you know, it's shameful that we even have to have a bill signed like this. But secondly, you know, there's such a healthy amount of distrust of our local law enforcement. I mean, all the way from city to federal, right? That prevents a lot of folks from reporting, one, right? And just trusting in law enforcement. And that's a big lift. So, you know, some of the things that I know some of us on this panel, some of the, you know, the chamber has been doing is actually engaging more with our local law enforcement authorities. In fact, some of them have reached out to us and say, how can we learn to be better allies, to establish or build some trust where trust has been lost or damaged, you know, and I appreciate that they're reaching out. that they know that there's a gap. But, and again, this recurring theme from the start of this conversation has been, it's just not isolated. You know, this anti-Asian hate bill is not isolated to anti-Asian hate. It is anti-racial hate, you know, really that we're trying to get through.
Joey and DJ, let me have you talk about kind of the sidewalk incidences, because as Chad said, it's not the big earth-shattering incident that may happen, but it's the death by 1,000 cuts, the daily grind of the existence of minorities. And I'm going to paraphrase a quote that somebody put in the chat a little bit earlier, that it's not the actual incident itself, it's the perpetual expectation or anxiety that that incident is going to happen. That is also part of the trauma and the stress. So I'll ask the two of you to talk about that. DJ, I'll let you start.
There's actually two parts to that. And you hit on, I think, one of the key pieces, and it's that emotional trauma, that it's not always the visible. And it's for also people to realize that for many of our communities, they have a history of trauma. And what's been happening is it's triggered old traumas. And one of the problems about trauma is feeling like you have no control. It's out of control. And that is something that you carry with you at all times. I don't want to shift gears too much, but another piece that one of the things that I get frustrated with is the issue around racism has been focusing on the hate crimes. Because when we have systemic racism, we're seeing with many of our communities, it's not the overt act, but it's lack of access to quality care. We're looking at the economic system. We're looking at so many of the social determinants of health, which really put our communities at greater risk for not being able to lead quality lives, not getting an education, not getting paid properly, have experienced serious mental health problems. And that's been pushed beside. So if there's a real frustration that I have, that's that there's almost too much focus on this. And it's not to say it's not important, but it's too narrow. And if we don't look at these other issues, that is going to go on. And that's when you have generation after generation after generation living in poor housing, not having access to care, and not having access to healthy foods, et cetera. And that's going to go on, that it makes it even more complicated. So I appreciate you just sort of pushing the envelope beyond that, because I think that's really where a lot of our conversations have to go. And we have to really push to make sure that we have resources really addressing this. It's collecting data that says, what do we need and why? What are some of the answers that are best practices models for healing our communities? And those are the very subtle but very profound issues that we have to address.
Go ahead, Joey.
Thank you. Thanks, DJ, for really bringing such a great perspective to it. And I definitely have to agree. It's not just hate crimes, right? It's those comments that you receive, the way that people look at you, the way that people avoid you, and all of that builds up just from the moment that you're born, being told in so many subtle ways that you're different and you don't belong. And it's also important to note that we're looking at a lot of these particular things, the rise in anti-Asian hate, as something that is maybe like external to the government or external to some of the structures. It's what other people are perpetuating on us. But a lot of this is, a lot of us need to realize that a lot of the issues facing the community come and stem from structural racism that's embedded into a lot of these systems. And the work needs to be broadened. It needs to be beyond that. Like DJ mentioned, we need to be gathering disaggregated data. We need to be seeing what are the gaps in our community that need to be filled, and we need to make sure we can provide for them. And in terms of trauma, living with this type of trauma every single day is incredibly difficult. And it's already shown in a lot of instances that Asian American Pacific Islanders have a lot of struggles in terms of mental health, and at the same time have one of the lowest help seeking rates. So they don't seek help, and a lot of folks are just struggling. So the trauma is important to acknowledge that it's not maybe just one instance that has happened to you. It's living an entire life of being told in so many different ways that you don't belong, and also that your issues aren't important. Because growing up, even for me, thinking about some of the things I went through, it seems so small compared to some of the other issues. It's like, well, at least no one hit me. At least I wasn't physically threatened. But the fact of the matter is, all of it does impact you, and it adds up. And it's important that we acknowledge that what we go through is traumatic, that it is valid, and if you need support, that you deserve it.
So when we talk about, and you all have mentioned this several times, that to isolate the conversation just to Asian Pacific Islanders in the oppression discussion and the racism discussion is creates a false narrative that there's intersectionality amongst us and our Indigenous brothers and sisters, amongst us and our Black brothers and sisters, our Latinx brothers and sisters, our diaspora brothers and sisters. And given that this is a group, particularly on this call, that are really interested in action. So what's the action? What are some of the actions we can use? And you can take it. I'll leave it to you for the unit of intervention you want to talk about. What could one person do if they are a bystander? What can an organization do? I've got lots of nonprofit organizations represented on this call. What could they be doing in their organization? What can communities do? So I'm going to let you all bind it however, or expand it however you'd like, but what's the way forward?
Karen, one of the things that you're already seeing is organizations like some of the nonprofits here, us panelists, we're speaking up. We're leveraging our voice. We all know it at some level. We are role models to our community and to our youth. And so when an incident and stuff like this is happening, there are a few of us who are willing to speak up. We're Joey was at the Capitol. I remember that. With her group and other community leaders who were on this call as well. But there's a whole bunch. I'll stop here for, so that the others can contribute. But being a role model and speaking up is how I show up.
I do want to mention, I dropped a resource and action card in the chat, and it is Colorado specific, but it also links to the national resource and action card. So it does give you a few ways to get involved. I understand sometimes folks who are new to this space find it very intimidating and they don't know where to start. So for folks that are looking just to get started, I really encourage you to take time to educate yourself. There is so much Asian American and Pacific Islander history and culture that is not taught in any formalized way, and that you have to actually do the work yourself. You have to go on Google, you have to buy some books, or you can check them out at the library to learn about what our experience is, because it's very varied. And so there needs to be some work done on what exactly is the Asian American, what is the Pacific Islander experience, what is that history locally and nationally. Even just in Colorado, we used to have a thriving Chinatown in downtown Denver. However, what had happened is there was an anti-Chinese race riot that destroyed all the businesses. They beat all the people there, and they murdered a man. And then because of subsequent racist policies, they were unable to rebuild again. And this was in Lodo. So if you've ever been to Lodo, you will probably notice that there is no evidence that there ever existed a Chinatown. In Colorado, we had a concentration camp for Japanese Americans. And although Governor Carr at the time was opposed to what was going on, he still allowed a concentration camp to exist here. And it did have better amenities than a lot of the other camps. But the fact of the matter is, the guns were still pointing in. So it's important that you understand the history and the context of the Asian American experience so you can be a better ally. So you do have a better understanding of what folks are going through. And then I would recommend also this book for specific to Colorado. It's called Asians in Colorado. It's by Dr. William Way, and it gives you more context on specific history in Colorado.
Chad or DJ? Anything else on that?
I'd love to hear what DJ thinks before I speak.
I was going to say the same to you, Chad. I agree with all the comments, and it is really, really important. There are a couple of things there because I don't want to repeat what was said because it was very well said. I'm going to repeat. It's really important to start with where we're at. We have to have real understanding of who we are and how we got to be where we're at, and not to be afraid to ask the hard questions. The flip side of that is also being willing to listen, which is really hard. I find myself so angry and so frustrated on many occasions that I immediately go to they. And in that action, I keep the divisiveness going. It's like, I cannot believe they think that, because the things are being said, I do find impossible to accept. But trying to understand, because if we don't get the dialogue continuing and having these discussions to make it safe, we see the divisiveness in this country that is just, the bridge just keeps growing, and it frightens me. It really, really does. One other piece, though, that of what we're doing, and again, this really comes from the mental health perspective, we cannot ignore the problems, but as long as we continue to also focus only on the negatives and what's happening to us, this is one of the things that happens in a racist society, is it does not respect what we bring to this country, the powers and the incredible richness of our communities. And that sort of goes back to what Joey's saying, is know what our histories are. If we know what that is, it's not just dealing with the symptom of the racism, it's being able to say, we have something to give to this country. If it weren't for the immigrants, this country would not be where it's at. Recognizing and respecting the Native Americans and indigenous populations. And so, again, it's so important that we have these very difficult conversations, but we have to really hold on to the gifts that we bring. And that's what helps heal me, is when I don't lose sight of that. When I just sort of claim, it's like, no, I would not trade being an Asian American, a Japanese American for anything. This is who I am. That's part of my healing process, and that's where my resilience is going to come from. So now I want to listen to what Chad has to say. Take it away, Chad.
I first want to thank, Clarence, Joey, and DJ for wrestling with this question of what we can do, right? I think that's always a really hard one. And for me, so my background is in political theory. It's kind of more philosophical orientation to politics, meaning we don't always talk about what can be done. I think that one of the things that's important for me is that while a lot of people are trying to find their way out of a problem, I'm still trying to find my way in, because the problem is so deep, it's so complex, it's so multifaceted, that if we think that we can have like a 1-hour discussion and say, okay, what can be done, then things will be good, I think we're off to a bad start. I think part of what I'm hearing a lot in this discussion so far is the need to really sit with the problems, to listen. And I think one of the important things about listening is the willingness to be changed. Okay, the willingness to be changed in ways that we may not be ready for at the moment, and that we need to continue to sit with that rather than dismiss those feelings in order for us to have a shot of moving forward. And I think one thing in that regard that I would emphasize, and I know that this came up a little bit as a term, and it's come up a lot in these discussions, is allyship, right? People want to know how to be a good ally. And my kind of take on that is like, that impulse is great, but I think allyship is not what we need. And I think that's also maybe not the best way to describe the problem. Because the notion of allyship means that you're on the outside over there, and you're coming over here to join us intermittently whenever these problems arise. And I think, as Joey pointed out earlier, right, then when the attention disappears, then allyship disappears as well. But I think what's more fundamentally wrong about the notion of allyship is that it turns anti-Asian racism into our problem. It's not our problem. Anti-Asian racism is a symptom of white supremacy. And if we view white supremacy as the framework that we're opposing, then allyship is not the answer. It's like, how can someone who's white be an ally in the struggle against white supremacy? No, the question is, how do we become allies in your struggle against your problem? And the fact is, people of color are at the forefront of those battles all the time.
Chad,
So I think that's the way that I would frame this question of action, that we need a different kind of paradigm in order to understand how we move forward from here.
Chad, if I'd known you were going to take us to church, I would have worn my hat. And I've been reading a lot lately now on this notion of the allyship isn't enough, because allyship is you're in and you're out at your, at your discretion. It could actually be quite passive. It's like, I got your back, or I support you, keep going. But the next level is to become an accomplice. And to be an accomplice, you are in it deep with me. We are planning, we are doing everything together. And, we are riding it. We're going to ride and die together till the wheels fall off. And so, excuse me. And I love that you reframed it. Say, no, we need to be your ally in the fight against the dismantling and disruption of white supremacy. And we could go, all kinds of ways on that. And this is a tangential question. It's a personal question and it's tangential. I am embarrassed to say that for, I'm 63, so that's probably the first 40 years of my life, I bought into the notion of the model minority. And so how do you see that playing in to everything we see happening and within to your communities today?
Oh, God.
We're all going to jump in on this. Go ahead, Clarence.
Oh my God! So the professional organization I work for and represent, is AAPI STEM talent, right? And while we celebrate AAPI STEM accomplishments, absolutely, right? There's moments in history all over the place where we've led, so to speak. Geez, we can spend days and days and days talking about this, Karen. The model minority myth is extremely destructive across all racial groups. The fact that, and again, we hold nothing against you, Karen. I mean, I'm the guilty guy too. Oh yeah, when you all go to college, right? Not if, right? When you earn your engineering degree, right? Not if, right? Guilty as charged, and there's some of that I pay it forward into my own kids, right? Well, I really need to gather my thoughts because it's such a loaded thing, right? That, yeah, we celebrate those, but at the same time, our Asianness is so complex. Not to speak, Harry B is on this call, he represents APDC and first generation immigrant and refugee families and students who don't have the same privileges and socioeconomic opportunities that I may have enjoyed growing up, right? We got to help them, right? The whole notion that we are subservient, we collectively, okay, are subservient and quiet. We're not going to raise hell and do all these things, and can't be further from the truth in many cases, right? There have been so many instances where we talked about those ebbs and flows. Arguably, Vincent Chin precipitated or crystallized the whole, Asian advocacy and activism movement, right? And many of you know who Vincent Chin is. And if you do not, get onto Canopy, go to a library, and you will find out how ugly, that chapter of history was.
And Clarence Harry Budasada said he's here just to heckle you.
Of course he is.
DJ, you want to comment on that?
And I agree with Clarence that this is a discussion that could take hours. So distilling it down to just a few sentences, the myth of the model minority is extraordinarily destructive. And it also comes about because the insensitivity to the Asian Americans forever, we've always been lumped and tagged as other. You have Black, Latino, white, and other. So we didn't even show up. Then when we show up, it's like Asian Americans. And the issue is not being able to disaggregate the data. Well, you aren't a big enough population to really warrant the resources to disaggregate the data. By failing to disaggregate the data, we don't see the complexities. And yes, there are Asian Americans who've been very successful, and we hope there's nothing wrong with being successful. But when you don't disaggregate the data and you have this bimodal distribution about those that have a higher income than the general population, and you've got those within our communities, the Hmong communities, the Bhutanese, who have higher rates of poverty, that gets lost and subsumed into, see, you don't have any problems. We're talking about the fastest growing ethnic community in the country, but yet with the lowest utilization rates. It's not because they don't see the problems, that's how the problems are defined from a Western mode of looking at mental health. There isn't access to, APDC is a wonderful place. We need to clone APDC and have these around the country. But because we don't have the disaggregated data to prove that we have the problems that we know that exist, and there's systemic racism, that's another way systemic racism shows up. We're not worth the time and the effort to collect the data that is crucial. It's not just hiring somebody who's Vietnamese to work in a large health organization. It's recognizing that there is value in an ethnic specific organization. And people say, well, it's divisive if you do it for just one population. It's like, it's not divisive. There is a reason for that. So again, this is a very complex issue, but then when we don't have the resources to show the problems we know exist, they say, well, you guys don't speak up because you don't have any problems. It's like, no, we don't have a voice. That's why, again, things like this are very, very important because it's getting that voice out there. It's letting people know there are problems. So we could just do away with the myth of minority. I don't know how many times we've written, and the myth of the model minority is really a problem. We could just make a rubber stamp it. Every time you write a paper or something, there it is, that it is an issue. So thank you for asking.
I wanted to give a bit of context on the model minority myth in case folks weren't really familiar with it. So it was first sort of popularized for the Asian American community around the 1960s, that for some reason it seemed that Japanese Americans were doing very well. They're very successful socioeconomically. They were having high educational attainment rates. And it's important to note that this particular stereotype was used as a racial wedge between Asian Americans and other communities of color. The model minority myth is a myth because when you disaggregate the data, like what DJ was saying, there are huge disparities within our population. We have the highest racial gap within a race as compared to any other ethnicity. And it's also important to note that the rhetoric surrounding the model minority myth was that, look, Asian Americans, they faced racism, they had issues, but they made it. So why can't you? And it's really disheartening to see that people had bought into this, people within the Asian American community, people outside the community. And this really saw a huge impact on relationships, especially between the Asian and the Black communities. And you can see a lot of it come to a head during the LA riots. And you can actually see a lot of the tension right now, as in some of the viral videos, some of the perpetrators of the anti-Asian hate incidences were Black, right? And similarly, in a lot of cases, there are a lot of Asian Americans that have a lot of inherent anti-Black biases. So you see this come to a heel right now. And we are at a I think a very crucial point where we must decide that we are stronger together than separated. The reason why we even have ethnic studies programs is because of the Third World Liberation Front that was started by students at the University of Berkeley. And these students were from all types of different backgrounds, including the Asian American Political Alliance, the Black Student Union, American Indian Movement. There is a Latinx coalition, Mexican coalition, and a Filipino coalition. They came together and staged the longest student strike in history, demanding the administration that they need better resources for the Black Studies program, and they need an ethnic studies program. So the only reason that we have it now is because we banded together. So it's important for us to really look through what is the model minority myth. We need to break it down and realize that it's used to split us, and that we are stronger together, and we must dispel this myth when possible and link together, because our liberations are all tied. The liberation for the Black community is tied to the liberation for our communities. The liberation for the Indigenous community is tied to our liberation. All marginalized communities, we are all tied together, and true change and true progress only comes when we're able to do it together.
And excuse me, so well said, Joy. And I certainly recognize now that the myth of the model minority is just yet another divide and conquer strategy. And those have been very effective strategies over the arc of history of the country. It's the house slave and the field slave. It's the uppity, it's the bougie and the working class. And so it's a very effective strategy that keeps us looking at each other and fighting with each other, and not facing the real issue and the real challenge that is systemic and structural racism that is binding us all. We're going to run out of time in just a moment. So let me first say, earlier in the conversation, Taryn, when she was opening, mentioned we would be sending a feedback form to folks in the mail the next couple of days. That's not true. We're actually going to just put it in the chat function. There'll be a link so that people can either complete it in one of the four languages that we're offering it. It's only 2 quick questions, so that's going to be in there. So thank you. And because we've only got 5 minutes left, earlier, sometime during this conversation, each of you has mentioned something about but I'm hopeful. And so you get 1 minute each to tell me what you're hopeful for and why you're hopeful. Chad, I'm gonna start with you.
Oh dear, I think I was the one who said I don't have hope, but let me try.
Oh, all right.
No, this is good actually. This is good because I think a lot of the conversation around hope has been seen what people in power, right? So what the president does, what Congress people do, and all of them, right? That's not where my site of hope lies, if I have any hope. My site of hope is the kind of intergenerational building of struggle and community in the face of immense violence. I think one of the ways in which Joey earlier described structural racism is spot on, right? That it's something that encompasses our entire lives. And I would add that it encompasses our lives in a state of unlivability, right? We're trapped in a state where we're not meant to survive. And I think the very fact that we have survived because people have struggled together, that's where the seed of my hope is. And the last thing I'll say in that regard is that it's not like the president who's a person in power. It's not Congress that's in power. It's the people. We're the ones in power. And that's why so much violence has to be marshaled against us to keep us down. If we were weak, then that wouldn't need to happen, right? You wouldn't need to build these institutions and these structures and these weapons and these borders and these walls and all of these other things to keep us down. No, we're the ones who are powerful. The ones who we think are in power, they're not in power, they're in positions of violence. And so power is on our side. And if there's any source of hope for me, that's where it is.
Thank you, Chad. Thank you, Clarence.
Nian, I gotta follow Chad. I am hopeful when I look at our grassroots, our work, in our communities. I am hopeful that And I cling on to this conviction that we as people in our communities are more common, or we have more commonalities, that we have differences. I don't give a hoot what color your skin is, because we all, in my ideal state, we all try to attain the same kind of goals for ourselves and our families and our communities. That gives me hope. That gives me strength to continue to do what, so many of us do here in our own community.
Thank you, Clara. Joey.
I like to echo what Clarence and Chad have been saying, at the risk of sounding redundant, but it really is looking at all of the coalition building going on and looking at our young budding activists and people really having this bottom up grassroots approach to saying that, this is no longer okay. We must make a difference. We must make a change. And I'm thinking of the most recent one of the more recent Black Lives Matter rallies was led by Ashira Campbell, who is, I believe she's 15 years old. Kai Wong, who is, I think 18, is doing a Asian American Pacific Islander rally this weekend. And then right after that, there's a Palestinian rally led by Nadine Ibrahim. And it's like, there are amazing things going on. There are a lot of young activists that are stepping up and working together. One of the our first town hall after what had happened in Atlanta, one of our attendees was Black Lives Matters 5280. And just sort of seeing that coalition building, seeing us reaching out to each other and saying, hey, how can I support you? That's what's going to make the difference. We need to continue to work together, because just even in this past year of coalition building, we've piled these resources together and saw, what can we do when we work together? When we did our Stop AAPI Hate rally in Colorado, we pulled it together about like a week and a half. And it was because everyone was willing to come and contribute, to give resources. Our allies were there to speak and they were donating their time. And this is what matters, is when we come together, you can see that our community is powerful and our community is to be reckoned with, and that our community can truly make a difference.
Thank you, Joey. And DJ.
In some ways, I'd have the easiest sort of finishing comments to say ditto, ditto, ditto to everything people have said, but it really is true. And when I think about having hope, part of it, having hope isn't the same as saying things are fine, but things are better. And I think when we lose hope, we lose the desire and the fight to make change. But we actually are, for all the reasons that the other panelists talked about. And coalitions are nothing that's new. They've been around for a long time. I remember we were starting the minority programs on the Sea Boulder campus. We were doing it together with the Latino, African American, and the American Indian communities. But it's being able to sort of build on that. And so it's like one step forward, half a step back, and then another step forward. So we're learning from those mistakes. And as we're seeing with the Black Lives Matter, more and more people joining on that fight. The fact that we have other people that are joining in and talking about and supporting the movement around stopping the anti-Asian hate, that's what gives me hope, is that we're less and less in a silo. And that does give me hope.
Excuse me, thank you all. These conversations that we have, and you all have reiterate this several times a day, the series that we've been doing for the past year and will continue to do at the heart of the matter. Every time we have the conversation, we just review the chapter, a new chapter of the same book. And it's the book of how do we disrupt, disturb, interrupt racist practices, policies, and perspectives so that communities aren't at least marginalized and at most oppressed. And the conversation is the same regardless of what group we're talking about. So this wasn't a conversation just about anti-Asian hate. It was a conversation about how to disrupt those systems so that communities are seen and not treated as invisible. so that their voices are heard and not dismissed, so that their uniqueness is appreciated and not feared and being a threat, so that they have the same opportunities to access to education, capital, health, food, you name it. And it's the same conversation. And I thank you for helping us skim this chapter in that book of Disrupting Systemic Racism. Thank you all so much, and thank everybody for joining us today. Bye-bye.